Hello, this will be our last video for the week, Thursday morning here, and I posted the worksheet for you yesterday. It was a little bit later in the day than I wanted, but it shouldn't take you that long, honestly. Just kind of helping you go back through, pick up on some of the key terms, key people, that sort of thing. That's due tomorrow by midnight, so just spend a little bit of time on that today, a little bit of time on that tomorrow, and shouldn't be too big a deal. Then we're going to move into the Industrial Revolution for the next few weeks after that, and that's really kind of a world-changing time period. Um, it's really kind of a watershed, especially if you include World War One. World War One is like a BC AD kind of dividing line in history in a lot of ways, and so we're going to take a look at that in the next couple weeks here. But now we just want to see kind of where the story with Napoleon goes. We saw his sort of meteoric rise from uh, a Corsican family that was nominal. They had some status, but weren't pure noble blood or anything like that. And he makes this rise all the way through the military ranks, takes control, crowns himself emperor. Now we want to take a look at what happened to his empire. Um, the first thing that was going on for France during his time as a consul is they were at war. It's pretty much constant for France, honestly, until you get into, well, the 20th century. Until about World War II, France is kind of like always at war. This pause that you see for France now is pretty rare if you trace their history, honestly. But he didn't think that they should be at war. He signed a peace treaty because he wanted to complete some of the aspects of the revolution. At least that was his excuse. He also, during that time period, when he signed the peace treaty, was negotiating with the United States to sell what we call the Louisiana Purchase to the United States. And turns out he wanted to do that so he could have money to conduct war. And he thought, okay, I don't want an empire in the New World. I want to focus on Europe. And so it's clear that he was always thinking about expanding his power and influence in Europe. And you can see that when war breaks out in 1803, especially against the British. And Britain is soon going to be joined by kind of a coalition of other countries, Russia, Sweden, and Prussia. And he actually defeats Russia, Sweden, and Prussia in quick succession. Battles like Austerlitz, for instance. These battles show kind of the genius of Napoleon. He's very, very aggressive. He has an interesting idea. It's almost like Blitzkrieg, where he wants to hit one part of the enemy's line as hard as he can, as fast as he can. He says basically, I don't need to outnumber you overall. I just need to outnumber you in one spot. If I can put more troops in one area than you can, and I can hit you hard enough that you can't respond, then I can overwhelm you even with a smaller force. And that was basically his style. That is really influential to lots of officers going forward. Guys like Stonewall Jackson is kind of the same way when you look at the American Civil War. Anyway, what that leaves is just the British. And so what he tries to install against the British before maybe invading is what was called the Continental System. And basically he wanted nobody to trade with the British. And that worked only to a certain degree. The British had a few sort of aces up their sleeves. They could trade with countries that were not in Europe, for instance. But this time period, what we might think of as like 1807 to 1812, Napoleon's the master of Europe. So he has what we might call the French Empire directly under his control, and that is France as we know it, but larger as well. Some parts of the Netherlands, into Germany, into Italy, actually, an expanded version of France. Then there were what were called dependent states. And these states were ones that had been defeated, and he had installed his relatives to be in charge. And so these countries basically responded directly to his beck and call. And then lastly, there were allied states. These were states that he had defeated, and he left their people in charge, left their politicians in place, but they were allies of France in the struggle against Britain. So the question is, okay, how does this go away? First problem is he was really struggling with defeating the British. There was a battle that really set him back. It's called the Battle of Trafalgar. If you know much about London geography, there's a really important square in London called Trafalgar Square. It's named after this battle. It's a naval battle, and it was really kind of putting a stop to Napoleon's designs of trying to invade England. But also the Continental Plan failed, mostly because Russia stopped following along. Russia sort of admired the British. There are actually eventually family ties between the British and the Russians by the time you get to World War I. But they admired the British holding out. They were a little less and less enamored with Napoleon and his sort of megalomania. And so they dropped out of the Continental Plan and started trading with the British, and that meant the Continental Plan was breaking apart. Also, remember, the British were able to trade with other people. Now, during this time period, we were caught in the middle, the United States. The British didn't want us trading with France, and the French didn't want us trading with the British. And so our merchant vessels were often being stopped on the high seas, and sailors being kidnapped, and supplies being stolen. So it was actually a tough time period for us leading into the War of 1812. But for Napoleon, he decided he had to make an example of Russia. So what he tried to do was invade Russia. He had an army of about 600,000 men. And he had a better army than Russia did. But here's what Russia did. They just retreated, constantly retreated. And they also employed a bit of a slash and burn technique, which basically said they were going to try to burn and destroy anything that might benefit Napoleon. They just kept backing up and backing up and backing up until winter came. And by the time winter came, Napoleon was basically in Moscow, but there was nothing there to supply his army. And so they had to give up. They had to turn around. A lot of the Eastern European soldiers that he had conscripted had already started to leave and try to head home because they saw a disaster coming. But this army basically was completely destroyed. I think it's like 40,000 people made it back to France out of the 600,000. So France was obviously quite weakened. And so other countries decided, okay, this is the time, let's take advantage. And so other countries that were, a part of this French continental system turned against France and actually restored the monarchy in France. They defeated it pretty quickly, and they put King Louis XVIII in charge, which was actually King Louis XVI's brother. At that point, Napoleon was exiled to an island called Elba. If you're familiar with the show, or not the show, the book and movie, The Count of Monte Cristo, there's actually a small portion at the very beginning that references Napoleon's exile to Elba. But he basically got restless. After about a year, he's like, I'm not staying here. So he pretty easily escaped. There were plenty of people who wanted to help him. And he escapes exile and he comes back into France, at which point the king sent troops to stop him and arrest him. And he basically said, he stood out in front of his troops. He said, here I am, your general. Whoever wants to shoot, go ahead and shoot. And of course, no one did. And he was welcomed back into Paris by the crowds as the conquering hero and quickly set about setting up a new army. In the matter of months, he was ready, he thought, to try to restore his empire. And what he decided to do was hit the troops that were stationed in Belgium just across the border from France. And these troops were kind of a coalition of troops, the British, the Belgians, the Prussians, and so forth. And they were led by a British commanding officer named the Duke of Wellington. And Napoleon attacked, and Wellington defeated him. It was a very, very bloody battle. It's actually a battle that plays a role at the very beginning of the musical Les Mis, which is actually a novel first, right? And it was a defining battle for French people for a long time. Whether or not you had been at Waterloo was an important story to be able to tell, and it was disastrous for the French army and disastrous for Napoleon. He was again captured and again exiled. This time farther out, more remote, an island called Saint Helena, basically out in the Atlantic Ocean. And he died not that long of a time later. He died in 1821. But what's interesting is actually he's buried in a very ornate, elaborate shrine, so to speak, in Paris. If you go to Paris, you can visit his grave, and it's very expansive, actually. Despite the fact that he was exiled twice and died in exile, he has this, massive gravesite. But you can see how quickly, if you think about it, how quickly Napoleon rose and then fell. 1799 is basically when he takes over, and by 1815 it's all done. So he has a short time period in charge, but it actually changes quite a bit. Changes the map of Europe. There's going to be a response to Napoleon from leadership around Europe. And he also changes warfare. The way that people fight is never going to go back to the way it was before Napoleon. Becomes more and more mobile, and his tactics are actually instructive to generations after his. Even up until World War I, really it's not until the machine gun comes along that Napoleon's tactics are outdone. His tactics become outdated when the machine gun means that you can protect a portion of a line with less troops, that you can't overwhelm one segment of the line the way Napoleon used to try to do. Anyway, I hope everything's going good for you. Looks like the weather's going to turn back in our direction in a couple of days here, so I hope you'll enjoy that. Hope you're well. We miss you guys, and let me know if you need anything at all.